I wasn't the kind of person who believed in miracles. I believed in bills, in medical charts, and in the cold, mathematical reality of my family's ruin. But when I was told I would be marrying him, I expected a ruthless tyrant. I expected a man who viewed the world as a chessboard, and me as a pawn he had simply purchased to settle an account. I didn't expect a man who would eventually flinch from the soft brush of my sleeve, his eyes wide with a quiet, exhausting terror. Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. That was the truth of my new life, reduced to ink and heavy parchment paper. The drive along the winding Pacific Northwest coast had been entirely silent, the heavy gray sky pressing down against the churning ocean below. The tires of the town car hissed against the wet asphalt, carrying me further away from the hospital, where my sister Clara lay, sleeping, and closer to the towering glass and stone mansion that would now be my home. I sat in the back seat with my hands folded tightly in my lap, feeling the chill of the window seep through the fabric of my dress. I did not cry. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. My mother was gone, Clara was fighting to stay, and my father, Thomas, sat beside me in the car, his posture rigid with a mixture of immense relief and quiet shame. The estate rose from the cliffside like a fortress of modern architecture. Beautiful but deeply isolating, it was a structure of sharp angles, endless panes of dark glass, and cold, polished stone. There were no flowers near the entrance, no signs of a bustling household, just the sound of the wind coming off the water and the distant, rhythmic crashing of the waves. When the massive timber doors opened, the air inside smelled of sterile ozone and old wood. There was no warmth in the foyer, no photographs lining the walls, just an echoing perfection that made me want to hold my breath. The wedding dinner was not a celebration. It was the clinical conclusion of a transaction. The three of us sat at a massive mahogany table that looked as though it belonged in a corporate boardroom, rather than a dining room. The overhead lighting was dim, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished surface. At the center of the table lay the marriage certificate, a stark white rectangle resting beside a heavy silver fountain pen. My father had signed his portion with a trembling hand, his eyes refusing to meet mine. I had signed my name with slow, deliberate strokes, anchoring myself to the reality of the ink binding me to this estate. Then, there was Julian. My husband sat at the head of the table, dressed in a sharply tailored dark suit that looked more like armor than formal wear. He was a man of striking, severe features, his jaw tight, his expression entirely unreadable. He did not speak of vows. He did not raise a glass in a toast, and he did not offer a single word of welcome. Instead, he stared straight ahead, his eyes tracking the minimal movements in the room with the hypervigilance of a man waiting for a blow. When the plated roast was served by a quiet, efficient housekeeper, the true depth of the tension in the room began to reveal itself. Julian did not eat. He picked up his knife and fork, holding them with a grip so tight, his knuckles were stark white beneath the dim lights. He began to cut the meat on his plate. His strokes were meticulous, perfectly measured, and entirely robotic. He sliced the roast into exact uniform pieces, drawing the blade back and forth with a terrifying rhythmic precision, but he never once brought the fork to his mouth. It was an exercise in control, a physical task, meant to anchor a mind that was quietly spiraling. I watched him quietly, my own food turning to ash in my mouth. I had prepared myself for dominance. I had built a mental fortress to withstand a man who would demand my obedience, who would parade his wealth and use my family's desperate debt as a weapon to force my submission. But the man sitting at the head of the table was not asserting power. He was barricading himself. The realization hit me when I reached across the table. The small crystal salt cellar was situated just out of my reach, resting inches from Julian's left hand. I leaned forward, my sleeve shifting, and extended my arm to retrieve it. I did not touch him. My hand was still hovering over the polished mahogany, a full breath of air between my fingers and his cuff. But the moment my shadow crossed his line of sight, the moment my physical presence encroached on his immediate space, Julian froze. The meticulous cutting stopped instantly. His shoulders jerked upward, locking into a posture of absolute defense. I paused my hand, suspended in the air, and looked at his face. His eyes were wide, the calm, unreadable facade shattering to reveal a flash of raw, unfiltered panic. The heavy silver knife in his right hand began to tremble, a fine, rapid vibration that rattled the blade against the porcelain plate with a sharp, high-pitched clink. He was terrified. I pulled my hand back slowly, deliberately pulling my arms close to my chest, retreating into my own chair. I did not apologize, because an apology would require him to acknowledge the loss of control, and I sensed that would only humiliate him further. The trembling in his hand slowly subsided, but the air in the room had grown incredibly thin. My father noticed nothing, his eyes fixed firmly on his own plate, chewing in a miserable, suffocating silence. Julian set his silverware down, the metal clattering against the plate. He did not look at me for the remainder of the hour. When dinner concluded, my father stood to leave. There were no warm embraces, only a brief, strained nod. Thomas walked out the imposing front doors, stepping back into the town car that would take him back to the city, back to the hospital where Clara waited. The thick entryways clicked shut, the sound echoing through the cavernous foyer like the dropping of a vault lock. I was entirely alone with the billionaire who had bought my life. The silence that descended upon the glass mansion was absolute. No music, no vows, just silence. Julian stood near the archway of the dining room, his gaze fixed on the floorboards. He finally turned and began walking toward the grand glass staircase, his footsteps heavy and measured. I followed him, keeping a careful, respectful distance, my low heels clicking against the cold stone steps. We walked through a long shadowed corridor on the second floor, the walls lined with tall windows that looked out over the pitch-black ocean. The storm was picking up, the rain lashing against the thick glass in angry, irregular bursts. We arrived at the master suite. Julian opened the door and stepped inside, leaving it ajar for me. I walked into the room. It was massive, sparse, and entirely devoid of personal warmth. The scent of sterile, cold air and heavy cedarwood hung in the room, grounding the space in a deep, melancholic stillness. A massive bed sat in the center, covered in immaculate white linens. The dressing room off to the side was illuminated by a low, amber light. Julian was standing in the center of the dressing room, his back to me. I stood near the doorway, my heart maintaining a slow, steady rhythm. I was not afraid of him, but I was acutely aware of the transactional nature of my presence. I was the debt bride. I was the payment. I had spent the last 3 weeks preparing my mind for this exact moment, building a quiet, unyielding barrier of self-respect that would allow me to endure whatever physical obligations this marriage required without losing my dignity. I took a deep breath, smoothing the fabric of my dress, and stepped into the dressing room. He was wearing a formal black wool coat over his suit, a heavy garment that looked stiff and uncomfortable. His shoulders were rigid, his hands resting on the edges of a polished wooden counter. I thought perhaps he was simply waiting for me to initiate, waiting for me to fulfill the role I had been brought here to play. I walked up behind him. My footsteps made no sound on the thick rug. I reached out, extending my hands to help him slide the thick winter overcoat from his broad shoulders. It was a small, practical act of service, a quiet concession to the reality of our shared space. My fingers brushed the dense, dark fabric, grazing the tense muscle beneath. The reaction was violent. It was not a rejection of anger, but a sudden, explosive physical recoil. Julian gasped, a sharp, ragged sound that tore through the silence of the room. He jerked away from my hands as if the wool had suddenly caught fire. His boots scrambled against the floorboards, throwing his balance off as he scrambled backward. I froze, pulling my hands back to my chest, my eyes wide in shock. Julian backed up until his shoulders hit the far wall of the massive dressing room. He didn't stop there. He slid along the wall, retreating into the furthest, darkest corner of the space, putting as much physical distance between us as the architecture would allow. He sank back against the corner, his breathing shallow and erratic. He crossed his arms over his chest, gripping his own biceps so tightly that the fabric of his coat strained against his knuckles. He was physically trying to hold himself together, shielding his body from the perceived threat of a single, gentle touch. He squeezed his eyes shut, his jaw trembling as he fought to regulate his breathing. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, my arms lowered to my sides. I did not step toward him. I did not speak to soothe him. I simply watched the powerful, untouchable tycoon crumble in the corner of his own sanctuary, his wealth and status entirely useless against the somatic terror crashing through his nervous system. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, broken only by the sound of the rain beating against the windows and the harsh, uneven sound of his breathing. Minutes passed. I remained rooted to the spot, offering him the only thing I could in that moment. Absolute, unmoving space. Finally, the trembling in his arms began to ease. His breathing slowed, dropping from a panicked rhythm to a deep, exhausted heaviness. He slowly opened his eyes, looking at me from across the room. There was no cruelty in his gaze. No arrogance, only a profound, humiliating vulnerability. He swallowed hard, his throat working against the silence. When he spoke, his voice was barely more than a rough whisper, scraping against the quiet walls of the room. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. The words were disjointed, a fragment of a thought that belonged to a different time, a different place. He wasn't talking to me. He was speaking to the memory that my touch had accidentally, violently awakened. He slowly uncrossed his arms, letting them drop to his sides, his outerwear hanging loosely around his frame. He pushed himself off the wall, standing tall once again, though the rigid perfection of his posture was gone, replaced by a deep, weary slump. "Evelyn," he said, his voice finding a fraction of its normal cadence, though it remained completely devoid of volume. He kept his distance, staying near the edge of the shadows. "I apologize. I cannot share this space." I nodded slowly, my voice calm, refusing to show pity, knowing that pity would only break him further. "I understand." He looked at the floor, his jaw clenching briefly. "The West Wing has been prepared. It is warm. There is a library attached to the sitting room. Margaret has made sure the fires are lit." He paused, his chest rising with a heavy breath. "I would ask that you take those chambers, for your own comfort, and for mine." He was asking me to leave. He was not banishing me as a punishment. He was retreating to preserve whatever fragile peace he had left. "Of course," I answered, my voice steady, betraying none of the profound shock echoing in my mind. Julian did not move until I turned around. I walked out of the dressing room, out of the master suite, and back into the long, shadowed corridor. I did not look back, but I could hear the solid, mahogany door of the bedroom click softly shut behind me, the lock engaging with a quiet, definitive finality. I stood alone in the hallway, listening to the storm rage against the glass. The contract I had signed was meant to bind me to a cold, transactional marriage. But as I walked slowly toward the warm, glowing light of the West Wing, I realized the absolute truth of my new reality. I had not been sold to a monster. I had been tethered to a ghost, and whatever had haunted him in the past, whatever had left him so deeply terrified of a human hand, was a debt far heavier than the one I had just been bought to repay. The West Wing was a different world entirely, separated from the sterile, freezing geometry of the master suite by a long, arching corridor of dark stone. As I moved further away from the epicenter of his panic, the air grew noticeably heavier. The sharp, clinical chill of the modern architecture faded, replaced by an atmosphere that smelled faintly of dried lavender, polished oak, and the comforting, dusty weight of old paper. The sitting room had been prepared for me, bathed in the low amber glow of a hearth fire that had been meticulously tended. I stood in the center of the space, listening to the relentless drumming of the coastal storm against the tall windows, grateful for the physical boundary the heavy oak doors provided. I did not feel rejected. I did not feel the sting of a bride cast aside on her wedding night. Instead, I felt a strange, profound sense of relief. Attached to the sitting room was a private library, exactly as Julian had promised. I pushed the double doors open, the hinges entirely silent. It was a cavernous space, lined from floor to ceiling with dark wood bookshelves, housing hundreds of leather-bound volumes and gray archival boxes. The room felt like a vault, a repository of forgotten time. In the far corner, resting on a heavy claw-footed mahogany desk, sat a bulky, archaic piece of machinery, an old microfilm reader, its glass screen dark and dormant, surrounded by neatly stacked wooden boxes of film reels and a scatter of yellowed newspaper clippings protected by transparent glass sleeves. I did not sleep that night. The adrenaline of the clinical wedding, the adrenaline of the clighting, the suffocating silence of the cold drive, and the shattering vulnerability I had witnessed in his dressing room made rest impossible. I could not close my eyes without seeing the wide, unfiltered terror in his gaze when my fingers had merely brushed his coat. Instead of lying in the massive, empty bed, I wrapped myself in a thick woolen shawl I found draped over a leather armchair and walked barefoot to the mahogany desk. I reached out and turned on a small brass reading lamp. Its warm, concentrated circle of light spilled over the brittle, yellowed clippings, illuminating a past that someone had carefully, obsessively preserved. The headline of the top clipping was faded, the black ink bleeding into the porous, textured paper, but the heavy block letters were stark and undeniable. Tragedy at Frost Enterprises. Industrial blaze claims life of Sarah Frost. The date printed in the top corner was exactly 20 years old. I pulled out the sturdy seat and sat down, my fingers tracing the cold edge of the glass sleeve. The article, written with the detached, clinical tone of investigative journalism, detailed a catastrophic fire at an early manufacturing facility. It spoke of a sudden structural collapse, an explosion of chemical storage tanks in the lower levels, and a desperate, chaotic evacuation. But the dry journalism could not hide the horrifying reality buried beneath the text. Sarah Frost, my husband's mother, had been trapped in the administrative wing when the ceiling gave way. Julian, only a young man at the time, had broken through the police barricades and gone back into the burning, toxic structure to pull her out. He had survived. She had not. My hands were trembling slightly as I loaded one of the microfilm reels into the old machine. The mechanical clicking and whirring sliced through the quiet room, a harsh, industrial sound that felt out of place in the elegant library. The screen flickered to life, projecting a harsh white light and negative text. I slowly turned the dial, scrolling through the archives of his pain. There were medical reports released to the press, updates on the young heir's critical condition, and paragraphs describing severe, extensive nerve damage and third-degree burns, covering his back and arms. It was the kind of catastrophic physical trauma that did not just scar the skin, but violently rewired the entire nervous system, turning the human body into an agonizing alarm system that could never be turned off. You won't find the whole truth in those papers, Mrs. Frost. I started, my hand slipping off the microfilm dial. I turned around to see Margaret Reynolds standing in the doorway of the library. The estate housekeeper moved with a quiet, dignified grace, carrying a small silver tray with a steaming ceramic mug and a folded white linen napkin. She wore a simple, immaculate dark dress, her silver hair pulled back into a severe knot, but her eyes, catching the amber light of the brass lamp, were remarkably gentle. "I didn't mean to pry," I said quietly, glancing down at the illuminated screen, feeling the sudden guilt of an intruder. I couldn't sleep. I needed to understand what happened tonight. Margaret walked slowly over to the desk and set the silver tray down on a clear patch of wood. The soothing scent of chamomile and warm honey rose into the air, creating a stark contrast to the dusty, metallic smell of the microfilm reader. She did not look at the screen. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what records were kept in this room. "He does not speak of it," Margaret said, her voice low, maintaining the hushed, protective reverence of the house. "Not to the corporate board, not to the doctors who come to adjust his pain management, and certainly not to the press. They look at him, and they see a ruthless billionaire who built an empire out of glass and code. They do not see the boy who crawled out of an inferno with his mother's ashes on his hands." I looked down at the yellowed newspaper clipping, staring at the grainy, black and white image of the collapsed building. "He flinched," I whispered, the memory of his violent recoil tightening my chest. "When I tried to help him with his coat, he backed into the corner of the dressing room like I was holding a weapon. He couldn't breathe." Margaret's expression softened, carrying a heavy, maternal sorrow that had clearly been accumulating for 2 decades. She reached out, her weathered fingers resting briefly on the edge of the mahogany desk, grounding herself. "He is not afraid of you, Evelyn. He is afraid of his own skin. The nerve damage left him hypersensitive to changes in temperature and pressure. But the reaction you saw, it is more than just physical pain." She paused, looking over her shoulder toward the dark hallway that led back to the main house. As if to ensure we were completely alone, Never approach him from behind. Never touch him without warning. When the factory roof collapsed, the burning steel beams fell from behind him. He did not see them coming. To this day, unexpected contact does not register to his brain as a touch. It registers as a physical strike. I absorbed her words, feeling the immense, crushing weight of them settle deep into my chest. The anger and defensive pride I had harbored over the transactional nature of our marriage dissolved entirely. It evaporated into the cold air, replaced by a profound, echoing ache. "I understand," I breathed, my voice barely audible. "And do not be alarmed if you see the lights on at all hours of the night," Margaret added, softly, turning to leave, her hands folding neatly in front of her. "He sleeps with every lamp burning in the master suite, not because he is working late, but because the dark reminds him of the thick, blinding smoke. If the room is completely black, he feels the ash in his lungs. He cannot breathe." She left the room, her soft footsteps fading into the long corridor until the silence reclaimed the library. I sat alone in the leather-backed chair, looking at the warm clay cup she had left for me. I reached out and wrapped my hands around the warm surface, letting the heat seep into my cold palms. I had thought I was the one trapped in this arrangement, sold like property, to pay off my father's astronomical debts. But Julian was trapped in a cage far more terrifying than any financial contract. He was a prisoner in his own body, locked in a continuous loop of survival. The severe coastal storm finally passed, leaving the isolated estate bathed in the pale, gray, hesitant light of the Pacific Northwest winter. Over the next 3 weeks, a strange, silent rhythms settled over the glass mansion. We did not speak. We did not share uncomfortable meals at the long, sterile mahogany table in the dining room. Julian remained secluded in the East Wing in his private study, managing his vast empire through encrypted servers and quiet phone calls, while I occupied the warm, lavender-scented sanctuary of the West Wing, acting as a quiet ghost, haunting the edges of his heavily guarded world. I did not attempt to force my presence upon him. I did not knock on his door to demand conversation, nor did I play the role of the devoted, attentive wife eager to prove her worth. I knew with absolute certainty that pushing him, demanding that he normalize our arrangement, would only trigger his defensive walls to rise higher and thicker. Desperation and crippling financial ruin have a way of erasing your options. Long before you even realize they are gone. My choices had been stripped away by circumstance, but Julian's choices had been stripped away by trauma. I refused to be another force backing him into a corner. Instead, I began to communicate in the only language he seemed to tolerate. The language of silent, practical care. I explored the Sprawlings estate and found a small sunlit glass conservatory at the back of the property, overgrown with neglected herbs, wild mint, and sprawling lavender bushes. It was a space that had clearly not been used in years, the stone floor covered in dry leaves and spilled earth. I spent my mornings there, tying my hair back and sinking my hands into the dark, damp soil, pruning the dead branches and harvesting the fragrant leaves. There was a profound dignity in the quiet labor, a sense of reclaiming my own autonomy through the simple act of nurturing something back to life. I found rolls of old, soft linen in the laundry stores, and spent my afternoons sitting by the window in the library, meticulously hand-stitching small, breathable pouches. I filled them with the dried lavender I had harvested, and fresh cedarwood shavings I had gathered from the fallen branches along the perimeter of the property. On the third Tuesday of my residency, I walked down the long, shadowed corridor toward Julian's study. The floorboards were cold beneath my feet. I did not knock. I simply knelt and placed one of the small, hand-stitched cedarwood satchels on the edge of the sleek console table outside his heavy oak door. Beside it, I left a hot earthenware cup of peppermint tea, brewed precisely to a temperature that would soothe the nervous system without burning the tongue. The sharp, clean scent of the mint and the grounding, earthy aroma of the cedarwood mingled in the sterile hallway air, creating a small, invisible perimeter of warmth. I turned and walked away long before the heavy door could open. I performed this ritual every single day. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, as the gray sky began to darken into twilight, I would leave a new scented packet and a freshly brewed cup outside his study. I never lingered in the hallway. I never waited for the door to open, and I never expected a word of thanks. I simply provided the sensory anchors, offering him a consistent, predictable routine that demanded absolutely nothing in return, not to force a connection, but to prove that I could exist in his space without being a threat. For the first few days, the tea remained untouched, growing cold and stagnant on the console table until Margaret quietly cleared it away. But on the 5th day, when I returned to the hallway to collect the drinkware myself, it was empty. The aromatic bag was gone, taken behind the heavy oak door. A quiet, profound shift began to occur in the geometry of our shared isolation. Julian did not thank me. He did not send a message or leave a note. But he began to alter his own rigid routines to acknowledge mine, stepping slightly out of his fortress to meet me in the spaces between. I spent my evenings in the West Wing library, sitting in the high-backed leather armchair near the open double doors, reading by the light of the single brass lamp. The hallway stretching out beyond the library was impossibly long and cast in deep, geometric shadows, the polished wood floor reflecting the pale moonlight that spilled through the tall architectural windows. It was during the 4th week that I first noticed him. I was reading a heavy, leather-bound volume on coastal botany, my finger slowly tracing the edge of the textured page, when a slight, almost imperceptible shift in the air current caught my attention. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, not with fear, but with a sudden hyper-aware electricity. I did not turn my head, but I allowed my peripheral vision to drift toward the open double doors. Julian was standing at the far end of the long hallway. He was a tall, still silhouette standing in the shadows, dressed in dark trousers and a simple, unbuttoned collar shirt, completely stripped of the rigid, tailored armor of his formal suits. He stood perfectly motionless, his hands resting deep in his pockets, his shoulder leaning just slightly against the cold glass pane of the window. He was watching me. My heart gave a quiet, measured beat against my ribs. I did not look up. I did not acknowledge him. I knew instinctively that if I made sudden eye contact, if I called out his name or shifted my posture to address him, the fragile spell would shatter, and he would retreat instantly into the dark. So, I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the page, turning the thick paper with a soft, deliberate rustle, allowing him to observe me from the absolute safety of his chosen distance. He stood there for exactly 10 minutes. I tracked the passage of time by the heavy, metallic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the library. During those 10 minutes, the silence between us stretched out across the hallway, thick and heavy, but it was no longer suffocating. It was a shared silence. I listened closely, tuning out the distant, rhythmic crashing of the ocean outside, and focused entirely on the faint, steady sound of his breathing echoing down the corridor. He was matching my breaths. Inhale, exhale, a slow, deliberate, physiological synchronization across 60 feet of empty space. He was regulating his own shattered nervous system by anchoring it to the calm, steady rhythm of mine. It was an act of profound, silent vulnerability. When the grandfather clock chimed the quarter hour, breaking the stillness with a low, resonant gong, I heard the soft, retreating sound of his footsteps. He walked back into the darkness of the East Wing, leaving no physical trace behind except the lingering, phantom scent of old wood and the peppermint infusion I had brewed for him. This became our unspoken evening ritual. Every night, I would sit in the armchair, bathed in the warm, amber light of the reading lamp, and he would emerge from his study to stand at the end of the hall. He never stepped closer. He never crossed the invisible boundary line that separated his protective shadows from my light. But for those 10 minutes, we existed in the exact same world, breathing the exact same air. I realized then that Julian Frost was not a man who needed to be saved, fixed, or pitied. He was a man who needed a sanctuary, where he did not have to constantly defend himself against the world. He had spent 20 years bracing for impact, expecting every sudden touch to bring agonizing pain, every dark shadow to bring suffocating smoke. I could not erase the thick, raised scars on his back, and I could not unwrite the tragedy that had burned his family to ash. But I could leave the tea. I could sew the little linen bags. I could sit in the quiet, golden light and let him watch me turn the pages of a book, proving night after night that I was not a threat. I was learning that the deepest, Most permanent vows are not spoken aloud at an altar, surrounded by cameras. They are made in the quiet, ordinary acts of showing up, day after day, and refusing to walk away when the silence gets heavy. The Pacific Northwest winter was not merely a season, it was an invading force. On the evening of my 5th week at the estate, the barometric pressure plummeted so rapidly that the sudden atmospheric shift made the quiet air in the corridors feel thick and heavy. The glass mansion, usually a silent, unyielding fortress of modern architecture, began to groan under the sheer, blunt force of the coastal wind. I was sitting in the west wing, the familiar scent of dried lavender and old paper failing to mask the rising tension of the storm outside. Rain did not just fall. It battered the massive architectural windows like handfuls of gravel thrown by an angry ocean. At exactly 8 o'clock, the grid failed. There was no preliminary flicker of the lamps. There was no slow, warning dim of the overhead bulbs. The estate was instantly plunged into absolute, suffocating blackness. The ambient, mechanical hum of the massive heating system died immediately, leaving a terrifying interior silence that was violently contrasted by the roaring squall outside. I sat perfectly still in the dark, my hands gripping the armrests of my chair, as my eyes struggled to adjust to an absence of light that felt almost physical. For a brief moment, I only felt the natural human instinct of mild alarm. Then, a singular, horrifying realization pierced through the quiet of my mind, freezing the blood in my veins. I remembered the quiet, devastating truth I had learned weeks ago. If the room is completely black, he feels the ash in his lungs. He cannot breathe. I didn't stop to think. I didn't wait for the backup generators to engage, knowing that the isolated coastal grid often took hours to reset during these severe squalls. I stood up, blindly navigating the pitch-black space by memory. I swept my hands along the edge of the polished console table near the doorway until my fingers grazed the cold, intricately etched metal of a silver pocket lantern. I grasped the heavy handle and clicked the brass ignition switch. A sharp spark snapped in the dark, followed immediately by a small, concentrated beam of pale light that sliced through the suffocating ink of the room. I stepped out of the west wing and into the cavernous main corridor. The house felt entirely unmoored, like a massive ship drifting without an engine. The shadows cast by the portable light stretched long and distorted against the stone walls. I walked quickly, the soft soles of my shoes making no sound against the floorboards. I did not check his study. The heavy oak door was wide open, the room inside completely empty. I turned toward the central wing, moving by instinct. The private library was not a room I intentionally sought out in the dark, but I found my feet carrying me toward its massive entryway regardless. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. The doors to the library were slightly ajar. I slipped through a narrow opening, holding the glowing device low to the ground to avoid casting a blinding beam across the space. The massive room was freezing, the temperature plummeting without the central heat. I found him near the far wall, trapped in the narrow space between the towering bookshelves and the heavy, claw-footed desk. Julian was completely cornered by his own mind. He was sitting on the floor, his knees pulled up tightly to his chest, his face buried in his hands. The polished, unyielding billionaire, who commanded vast tech empires, had entirely vanished. In his place was a man actively drowning in a memory. His breathing was a horrific, ragged sound, shallow, sprat gasps that scraped against the silence of the room. He was hyperventilating, his broad shoulders heaving erratically as his overloaded sensory network convinced his brain that the dark room was rapidly filling with thick, toxic smoke. Every human instinct I possessed screamed at me to close the distance. Society conditions women to soothe, to embrace, to throw our arms around the shoulders of those who are breaking and hold them tightly until the panic subsides. I wanted to drop to my knees, pull his head to my chest, and rock him through the terror prun, but I stopped. I locked my knees and forced my feet to remain planted exactly 3 feet away from him. I remembered the violent, terrifying recoil of my wedding night. I knew with absolute certainty that if I touched him now, if I laid a single unexpected finger on his skin while his mind was trapped in that burning building, it would not comfort him. It would register as a falling beam. It would break him completely. The true measure of devotion was not doing what made me feel like a savior. It was doing exactly what he needed to survive. I lowered myself slowly onto the cold hardwood floor, maintaining the strict boundary between us. I set the brass-trimmed light on the ground, intentionally pointing the beam away from his face, so it illuminated the worn spines of the books on the lowest shelf. It cast a gentle, indirect glow across the floorboards, just enough to prove that the darkness was not absolute. I did not reach for him. I folded my hands tightly in my lap, anchoring myself, and began to speak. "Julian," I said. My voice was low, rhythmic, and entirely devoid of panic. I did not ask him if he was all right. I did not tell him to calm down. I bypassed his rational brain entirely and spoke directly to his sensory reality, offering him a lifeline of undeniable facts. "You are in the library," I said, keeping the cadence of my words as steady as a metronome. "The floor beneath you is cold oak. Feel the grain of the wood against your shoes. It is cold. There is no heat here. The walls are made of stone and glass. The only thing you are breathing is the scent of old paper and the rain coming off the ocean." He flinched at the sound of my voice, a sharp tremor wrecking his frame, but he did not scramble backward. His ragged breathing caught in his throat, pausing for a fraction of a second to listen. "Look at the light," I commanded softly, my voice holding a gentle but unyielding authority. "It is just a silver lantern. It is casting a shadow against the desk. The desk is just a yard to your left. I am exactly 3 feet in front of you. I am not moving. I am not going to cross this line. You are perfectly safe in this space." I kept speaking. I described the exact texture of the Persian rug beneath the desk. I described the cold, metallic smell of the storm leaking through the window frames. I listed the physical, present realities of the room over and over again, building a bridge of words for him to walk across, leading him away from the burning wreckage of past and back into the freezing quiet of the present. It took 20 agonizing minutes. I sat on the hard floor, my own legs going numb from the cold, refusing to stop the steady rhythm of my voice. Slowly, the horrific oxygen-starved gasps began to decelerate. The frantic heaving of his chest smoothed out into deep, exhausted, trembling breaths. He slowly lowered his hands from his face. His eyes were bloodshot and wide, catching the faint, indirect glow of the lantern. He looked at the floorboards, then at the desk, and finally, his gaze landed on me, sitting motionless that short distance away. He realized what I had done. He realized I had witnessed the absolute collapse of his armor. And more importantly, he realized I had possessed the profound restraint to respect his physical boundaries, even when he was completely defenseless. The storm outside raged on, hurling rain against the heavy glass, but the terrifying storm inside the library had finally broken. Julian swallowed hard, his throat working against the dry, cold air. He did not say thank you. The gratitude vibrating in the heavy silence between us was too massive, too raw to be contained in ordinary words. He simply shifted his weight, leaning his back heavily against the side of the desk, his long legs stretching out across the floor. He was utterly drained, his physical strength depleted by the massive adrenaline surge of the somatic flashback. The ambient temperature in the room continued to drop. The chill of the unheated mansion was beginning to seep through the fabric of my dress, raising goosebumps along my arms. I looked toward the massive stone fireplace at the other end of the library. The fire Margaret had laid hours ago had burned down to nothing but a bed of dying embers, glowing with a faint, angry orange heat beneath a layer of white ash. "We should move closer to the hearth," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "The stone will hold the heat for a few more hours." Julian did not argue. He nodded once, a slow, heavy movement. I stood up first, picking up the metal lamp, and walked toward the fireplace. I did not offer him my hand to help him up. I allowed him the dignity of recovering his own balance in the dark. I heard the rustle of his clothing, the soft scrape of his shoes against the oak, and then the quiet, measured sound of his footsteps following me across the room. I set the lantern on the mantelpiece. The twin leather armchairs facing the hearth were shrouded in shadows. I sat in the right chair, pulling my knees up slightly to conserve body heat. Julian sank into the left chair, resting his elbows on his knees and clasping his large, scarred hands together. He stared directly into the fading coals, the faint orange light reflecting in his dark, exhausted eyes. The silence stretched between us, completely different from the suffocating tension of our wedding night. This silence was hollowed out, exhausted, and strangely peaceful. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the artillery has finally stopped firing. "The smoke," Julian whispered suddenly. His voice was hoarse, scraping against the quiet walls of the room like sandpaper. It was the first time he had ever spoken of it voluntarily. He did not turn his head to look at me. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the glowing ash. "The smoke is always what comes first," he continued, his tone stripped of all emotion, reduced to a flat, clinical recitation of a nightmare. "People think it is the heat that traps you. It isn't. The smoke blinds you instantly. It fills your throat with gravel. You lose all sense of direction within 3 seconds. Up becomes down. The doors disappear. I did not move. I barely breathed. I sat perfectly still in the leather chair, bearing silent witness to the excruciating unraveling of his deepest trauma. "I broke through the line," Julian said, his voice dropping lower, his fingers tightening around each other until his knuckles turned stark white. "The fire crews told me to stay back. The structural integrity was gone. But my mother was in the administrative wing. I knew exactly where her office was. I thought I could navigate the corridor by memory. I thought I was fast enough." He paused, a ragged, uneven breath escaping his lips. The shadows in the room seemed to press closer, heavy with the weight of a 20-year-old grief. "I found her," he whispered, the words fracturing as they left his mouth. "I reached her office. But the ceiling, the steel support beams, they gave way before I could get her to the stairwell. They fell from behind. I never saw them coming." He fell silent. The absolute horror of the memory hung suspended in the freezing air of the library. He had carried the agonizing weight of that failure every single day of his life. He had built an empire, amassed billions, constructed a fortress of glass and stone, all in a futile attempt to armor himself against a guilt that lived permanently beneath his own scarred skin. He had survived the fire, but a fundamental part of his soul had burned to ash on that factory floor, leaving him trapped in a perpetual state of hypervigilance, terrified of the unexpected strike in the dark. I looked at him sitting in the cold shadows, his broad shoulders slumped, entirely stripped of his terrifying reputation. My chest ached with a profound, overwhelming sorrow, not just for the boy who had lost his mother, but for the man who had punished himself for surviving ever since. I stood up from the armchair. Julian tensed slightly at the movement, his peripheral vision tracking my shadow, but he did not flinch away. I walked over to the small sofa near the wall and picked up a thick, heavy woolen throw blanket that had been folded neatly over the armrest. I carried the heavy fabric back toward the hearth. I walked to the side of his armchair. I did not stand behind him. I made sure I was firmly within his line of sight, moving with slow, exaggerated transparency, so his frayed nerves could track exactly what I was doing. I held the heavy woolen blanket by the extreme upper corners, keeping my hands as far apart as possible. I looked down at him. His eyes flicked up to meet mine, wide and guarded, waiting for the physical intrusion he feared above all else. "Tell me to stop," I whispered, my voice completely steady. Julian looked at the blanket suspended between my hands, then looked up into my face. The muscles in his jaw flexed, fighting a violent internal war between his desperate need for warmth and his absolute terror of contact. He did not speak. He did not tell me to stop. He simply closed his eyes and let out a long, trembling breath. I stepped inches closer. I lowered the heavy woolen blanket over his broad shoulders with tactical, agonizing precision. I held the extreme edges of the fabric, ensuring that my knuckles, my wrists, and my fingers remained entirely suspended in the air. I let the heavy weight of the wool settle over his back, draping the edges over his chest, without a single millimeter of my skin ever grazing his collar, his neck, or his clothing. The moment the weight of the blanket settled on him, Julian flinched, a microscopic, involuntary shudder, anticipating the strike of the burning steel. But the strike never came. There was only the soft, heavy, protective weight of the wool, and the freezing air instantly warming against his body. I released the edges of the blanket, and immediately took a step back, retreating to the safety of my own chair to re-establish the boundary. Julian opened his eyes. He sat perfectly still for a moment, processing the reality that he had just been touched, cared for, and covered without suffering an ounce of pain. Slowly, his large, scarred hands came up from his lap. He grabbed the extreme edges of the blanket where my hands had just been, his long fingers clutching the thick wool with a grip so fierce it looked like he was holding onto the edge of a cliff. He pulled the fabric tighter around his shoulders, burying his chin into the warm collar. The tension in the library fundamentally shifted. The clinical, transactional nature of our marriage shattered completely, falling away, like brittle glass, to reveal the raw, unpolished truth of two deeply wounded people sitting in the dark. I had respected his trauma over my own pride. I had given him a sanctuary. We sat in silence for a long time, listening to the relentless drumming of the rain against the coastal windows. The smoldering ashes popped, sending a final, tiny spray of orange sparks up the chimney. Julian did not turn his head, but his grip on the blanket shifted slightly. When he spoke again, his voice was no longer a desperate rasp. It was low, quiet, and carried a profound, humbling weight. "I heard you cry," he whispered into the dark. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. 3 nights ago, I had received a call from the hospital regarding my sister Clara's declining vitals. I had buried my face in my pillow in the West Wing, muffling my sobs so completely. I was certain the sound had not escaped the room. I had wept for my family's ruin, for the terrifying isolation of my new life, and for the heavy, unyielding debt that had brought me to this glass mansion. I didn't like it. Julian finished softly. He didn't elaborate. He didn't offer a grand, eloquent explanation. But those 8 words struck me with the force of a physical blow. He had heard me. From across the massive, echoing estate, from behind the closed doors of his own heavily guarded world, he had been listening. While I had been quietly leaving herbal infusions outside his door to soothe his trauma, he had been standing in the dark corridors of his own fears, profoundly disturbed by my silent grief. I pulled my knees tighter against my chest, a sudden overwhelming warmth flooding my cold veins. I realized then that the towering, ruthless billionaire who feared the brush of a human hand was not entirely walled off from the world. His armor was thick, his scars were devastating, but beneath it all, he was quietly, fiercely protective. The storm raged outside, shaking the transparent panes and granite framework of the estate. But inside the dark library, sitting across from the man who was terrified to touch me, I felt a strange, undeniable truth settle into my bones. For the first time since my father had signed away my future on a piece of parchment paper, I did not feel like a debt being paid. I felt in the absolute quiet of the freezing room, entirely and completely safe. By morning, the coastal squall had exhausted itself completely. The violent wind, which had battered the heavy architectural panes with such relentless ferocity the night before, softened into a quiet, rhythmic ocean breeze. The backup generators had finally engaged just before dawn, bringing a low mechanical hum back to the estate, but the suffocating, sterile isolation of the glass mansion had already been broken. I woke up in my armchair, in the West Wing, the thick fabric of the woolen blanket still wrapped securely around my shoulders. I had left the private library shortly after Julian fell into a deep, exhausted sleep by the glowing remnants in the fireplace, intentionally retreating to give his shattered nervous system the quiet space it needed to recover. When I stepped out of my chambers and walked into the main corridor, the house felt fundamentally altered. The sharp, clinical chill that usually defined the towering architecture had somehow evaporated, replaced by a still, settled calm. The morning sun broke through the heavy gray clouds, casting pale, golden squares of light across the polished stone floorboards. As I approached the grand staircase, I found Margaret standing near the banister, holding a folded linen towel. The fiercely loyal housekeeper did not offer her usual polite, distant nod. Instead, she paused, her hands resting quietly on the fabric, and offered a small, genuine smile. Her eyes, usually guarded and protective of her employer, held a profound, unspoken gratitude. She told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that he was waiting for me in the East Wing. He was not in the corporate office where he managed his vast empires, nor was he in the austere study. He was at the very end of the hall, behind a thick, iron-reinforced barrier that had remained locked since the day of my arrival. I walked slowly down the long, sunlit corridor, my footsteps making no sound against the floor. The door was pushed wide open, an invitation that required no spoken words. I stepped over the threshold and immediately realized that this was not a room belonging to a ruthless tech tycoon. It was the deeply guarded sanctuary of a wounded artisan. The air inside was thick and warm, heavily saturated with the rich, earthy scent of raw cedarwood, sweet linseed oil, and dried sawdust. The walls were lined with meticulously organized hand tools, chisels, wooden mallets, and heavy iron clamps, hanging above a massive, deeply worn workbench that spanned the entire length of the room. Wood shavings curled across the stone floor like scattered autumn leaves, softening the harsh geometry of the estate. Julian was standing at the bench, wearing a simple faded canvas apron over his shirt, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows. Standing quietly beside him was a man I recognized from the clinical archive files as Dr. Sterling. The physician was conducting a brief, routine medical check-in, a necessity following the massive adrenaline surge of the previous night. I hung back by the doorway, leaning slightly against the doorframe, watching as the older man asked his patient to extend his right arm. Dr. Sterling gently traced the dull edge of a medical tuning fork along the thick, raised burns that traveled up Julian's forearm, carefully monitoring the hypersensitive nerve responses. There was no violent recoil today. The craftsman's posture remained rigid, his jaw set in intense concentration, but he was breathing steadily. His dark eyes were focused entirely on a block of raw oak resting on the table, using the visual anchor to ground his physical sensations. Arthur Sterling watched the steady rise and fall of his patient's chest, then nodded slowly, writing a single line in a leather-bound notebook before packing his instruments into a weathered black bag. The doctor turned, catching my eye as he walked toward the exit. He did not offer a formal greeting, nor did he offer unsolicited medical advice. He simply gave me a long, quiet look that conveyed a lifetime of exhausted relief. He had been treating a haunted ghost for 20 years, managing a somatic terror that no medication could cure, and today he was looking at a man who was finally anchored to the living. When the physician's soft footsteps faded completely down the hall, Julian reached across the bench and picked up a heavy iron handplane. I stepped closer, moving directly into the warm, golden light of the workshop. I did not speak. I simply watched his hands. The scars on his forearms were stark white in the morning sun, a permanent, undeniable map of his survival. He pressed the sharp blade against the rough edge of the oak block and pushed forward with a slow, deliberate force. The tool let out a satisfying, resonant hiss, peeling away a paper-thin ribbon of wood that curled beautifully over the dark metal. He pulled the plane back and repeated the motion, establishing a slow, hypnotic rhythm that filled the quiet room. He did not look up from his labor, but his voice broke the comfortable silence. It was clear and remarkably steady, entirely devoid of the frantic, scraping rasp from the dark library. "Wood is predictable," he said, running his calloused thumb lightly over the freshly smoothed surface of the oak. "It responds logically to the environment. If you take the time to understand the grain, if you apply the exact right amount of steam or pressure, you know exactly how it will bend. It doesn't fight you. It doesn't betray you." He set the heavy iron tool down on the worn table, the metal clinking softly against the timber. "Human skin is not like that," he continued, staring at his own hands, his voice dropping into a deeper, heavier register. "It burns. It breaks in a fraction of a second. It remembers the absolute heat of the fire long after the flames are extinguished, turning every sudden shadow into a falling beam and every unexpected touch into a weapon." He finally turned his head, his dark eyes rising to meet mine. The impenetrable, cold fortress he usually projected to the world was completely dismantled. In its place was a quiet, desperate honesty that demanded immense courage to reveal. "I have spent my entire adult life trying to control every single variable around me, because I could not control the terror inside my own body," he confessed quietly, the ambient dust motes drifting slowly between us. "I thought if I built an empire out of cold glass, sterile environments, and silent financial contracts, nothing could ever surprise me again. I thought I could buy a life that required no vulnerability. But then you walked into the dressing room on our wedding night. I walked up to the edge of the workbench, closing the physical distance between us until I was standing entirely within his immediate, guarded perimeter. I looked down at the surface of the table. Resting near the heavy clamps was a small, delicate object he had clearly been carving for days. It was a wooden swallow, its wings swept back in mid-flight, the tiny feathers etched with agonizing precision. It was completely smooth, sanded down to a flawless, buttery texture that practically begged to be held. "You made this," I whispered. I did not reach for him. I reached for the bird. I let my fingertips graze the smooth curve of the carved wing, marveling at the profound contrast between his massive, traumatized hands and the delicate, fragile beauty they were capable of creating. The small object was a physical manifestation of his true self, a man who looked like unyielding steel, but was built entirely out of quiet, meticulous care. "I used to watch them from the hospital window," he said, taking a microscopic step closer. His voice was a low, resonant rumble in the warm room. When the pain in my spine was too severe to allow sleep, I would watch the swallows outside the glass. They always know exactly when to change direction to avoid the freezing air. They know exactly when to leave a place that can no longer keep them safe. I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the wooden carving, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The transactional nature of our marriage, the crippling debts my father had left behind, and the cold isolation of my arrival all seemed like lifetimes ago. "I am not flying anywhere," I said quietly, my voice entirely steady. The silence in the workshop deepened, expanding until it filled every single corner of the rustic room. The comforting scent of raw cedarwood and warm sunlight wrapped around us, acting as a stark, undeniable contrast to the terrifying, suffocating smoke he had battled for 2 decades. I left my hand resting flat on the worn wooden surface of the workbench. My fingers splayed slightly near the swallow. I did not move toward him. I did not push for a reaction. I simply offered him the exact same, quiet, unyielding space I had given him in the dark, allowing him absolute control over the boundary. I saw the movement in my peripheral vision. Julian took a slow breath, his chest expanding with a deliberate, measured intake of air. He lifted his right hand from his side. The movement was incredibly hesitant at first, a visible tremor vibrating through his thick wrist as his traumatized reflexes immediately sounded their silent, frantic alarms. Every somatic instinct he possessed was screaming at him to pull back, to retreat to the safety of isolation. But he fought through the rising panic. He overrode 20 years of physiological terror with a sheer, overwhelming act of devotion. Slowly, agonizingly, slowly, he brought his hand down toward the table. He did not hover. He did not ask for verbal permission. He simply lowered his large, scarred palm directly over mine. The moment his skin made contact with the back of my hand, he froze completely. A sharp, involuntary intake of breath hitched high in his throat, his broad shoulders locking tight as he waited for the phantom strike of the burning steel, waiting for the agony to rip through his hypersensitive nerve endings. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. Nor did I try to adjust my grip to comfort him. I kept my hand perfectly, resolutely still, projecting every ounce of calm, grounding warmth I possessed up into his trembling palm, serving as a silent physical anchor to the present moment. The strike never came. Seconds ticked by, marked only by the slow, hypnotic drift of the sawdust dancing in the sunbeams. The rigid, terrifying tension in his arm slowly began to fracture. The violent tremor in his wrist dissolved into the warmth of my skin. He slowly exhaled, a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to carry 20 years of agonizing isolation out of his lungs and into the open air. He closed his eyes, his tall frame slumping slightly as the massive, invisible weight of his trauma finally lifted off his shoulders. He did not pull his hand back. Instead, he shifted his grip, sliding his long, calloused fingers gently between mine. He pressed his palm, fully against the back of my hand, anchoring himself entirely to my warmth, claiming the physical connection he had violently denied himself for an entire lifetime. The skin of his hand was rough, textured by years of shaping raw timber, but the touch was incredibly, heartbreakingly gentle. "Home isn't a place or a name," he whispered, his voice thick with a raw, unprotected emotion that he no longer tried to hide behind a mask of cold authority. "It's a person." People ask sometimes, in the rare moments we return to the city, what exactly changed between the ruthless tycoon and the desperate bride. I don't know if I have a good, simple answer for them. Maybe nothing changed. Maybe everything did. All I know with absolute certainty is this. The man who once offered me a clinical financial contract now offers me a cup of warm peppermint tea every single morning in a sunlit workshop. The towering, untouchable billionaire who terrified the corporate world now spends his quiet evenings teaching me how to smooth the grain of raw oak. The heavy family debt that initially brought me to this isolated glass estate was very real, but the unyielding sanctuary we built together out of the splinters of our past was vastly stronger. He no longer sleeps with all the lamps burning in the master suite, because the dark is no longer filled with toxic smoke and falling beams. It is filled only with the quiet, steady rhythm of our shared breathing and the simple, profound safety of a hand holding mine. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. If this journey brought you a sense of peace tonight, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to sit with us again in the silence.